Well, after that introduction, I think I'm just going to sit down and listen tonight. So, my name's Aaron. I'm an alcoholic. And thank you to Cliff and Lori for inviting me out here. You know, it is, like Brian was saying, it's an honor and a privilege that gets said a lot. It is a true honor and a privilege to do anything for Alcoholics Anonymous and to be able to travel and even see Oklahoma as flat as it was. I thought I saw the landing strip like 10 times, but I finally made it in. But just a pleasure to be here. How about the voice, right? How about the voice? Let's hear it for the voice. I told her the pressure was on her. I told Katie the pressure was on her because that sets the energy for the conference, and that's the truth, right? My sponsor always told me you'll watch meetings ebb and flow by the energy of the secretary or the leader of the group. So it really does help to have that energy up here. I appreciate it. Roger back there, please go support this man. You know, it's the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we don't have the Bill W. talks and the Chuck C. and all that with guys like Roger still out doing the deal. And he's giving free hugs back there, so please go visit him. I had to tell Brian after, I don't know if you saw the introduction last night to the speaker, but there was something about, I think Amy said, now I'll be watching her butt all night. And I'm like, Brian, we're not doing that. All right. I said right off the bat, let's get that straight right now. And so the speakers have been great, you know, and I've heard Miss Phyllis, you know, I just love you to death. You know, I met you many years ago and just love you to death. And Angie, you know, for hitting on the 12 steps and last night, you know, just all around. But what I got to say is, Karen, where's Karen at? Thank you for putting together the panels, because the panels have been absolutely outstanding. You know, across the board, the young persons panel was just great yesterday, and I thought it was a great way to start out the roundup. You know, just coming in and hearing those guys talk and where they are and that spark for Alcoholics Anonymous is what plugs me back in. That's what I need to hear. You know, I need to hear those guys that are brand new, and it takes me back to the day one, why I was happy, why I was excited. You know, if I ever lose that, it's the new guys that remind me of that. So thank you guys. Everybody that's participated in this thing, you know, thank you. You know, I love Alcoholics Anonymous. If that doesn't come through in some way, then you might be deaf. So I had the pleasure, Brian has been a great host, took me out for steak lunch yesterday, which was right off the bat. I had the pleasure of meeting his daughter Lyric this morning. They picked me up, and she wouldn't talk to me right off the bat, but I said, hey, I'm going to win her over, right? And by the time I got here, she had punched me in the stomach 3 times. So I'm like, I think we're good. She still wouldn't talk to me, so I'm leaving the truck. He's dropping me off at the hotel, and I said, all right, we're best friends, right? And she doesn't say anything to me. And as they're leaving, she makes it a point to roll down the window and go, we are not best friends. And I said, so long story short, I think I'm sponsoring her now. Yeah, like that's kind of the relationship I have with my sponsees, right? We are not best friends. So anyway, pleasure to be here, you know, talking to the nap crowd, 3 o'clock afternoon after the lunch, so hope you stay awake. Like I said, my name's Aaron, I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date, January 24th, 2007. I have a home group, the Can Be Saturday breakfast meeting. We bounce around a lot. We now meet at Jarbo's Restaurant, 9 a.m. every Saturday. If you come through town, like I told Brian, I will buy you breakfast. I think Phyllis has actually came there and chaired, and you know, that's one of my things. If you come through my home, it's my home group, and I love to do that for people. You stop in and you get to meet some of the people that have changed my life. You know, it's been my home group since I came in, you know, almost 18 years ago. So people in there literally changed my life. Please stop by if you're in town. Another important thing, I have a sponsor who knows he's my sponsor. That's important. I always hold some sort of active service position in Alcoholics Anonymous. And most importantly, you know, I work the 12 steps on a regular basis, you know, and that's what keeps me in the middle of it. And Angie and Phyllis did a great job this morning. I think both of them hit it on the 12 steps, all 12 steps. And I'm probably not going to do that today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience, strength, and hope. And but the steps are imperative to my recovery. But I'm going to tell you how I came in here. I'll tell you a little bit about how I grew up. I grew up in a tiny little town called Eddyville, Oregon. And if you haven't heard of Eddyville, nobody in Oregon has either. I graduated 19 kids in my class, pretty much the same 19 that I started with, right? And it was just a little bump in the road. That's when logging was a big industry out in Oregon, and my reforestation. I grew up in reforestation and logging industry. That's what my dad was into. That's what my mom worked for his company. And so I grew up in a drinking culture. My dad was like, they did the tree planting side. They were a little bit more of the long-haired guys. I grew up around, a lot of outside issues. I call them drugs, so let's just get that out of the way. Some of them are legal in Oregon now, but so I got out of school. I took my first drink, 4 years old. I'm not going to say I started drinking when I was 4, but it was accessible. My parents were both functioning alcoholics. My grandfather was a functioning alcoholic. He was head of sales for Olympia Brewing Company back when that was the big beer out in the West. So we had Olympia everything, and I lived kind of a lawless lifestyle, out in the country. I always say every season was hunting season for my dad, I'll put it that way. And I grew up on a lot of venison, and that's just the way it was. It wasn't ever said, hey, Aaron, don't go to school and talk about this stuff. It was just country living. So I graduated. I first started drinking, I'd say, on a regular basis at the age of 15. And that's when I first started partying. And I can't remember who was saying it, but it's like I drank alcoholically. I think it was Lisa last night. I drank alcoholically from the first time that I drank. And, I just didn't know when it was going to end. I didn't want it to end. I'm not that guy that's going to stand up here and say, I drank because my life was rough or this or that. Once I ingested alcohol into my system, I drank because I loved the effect produced by alcohol, right? And it just turned me into a wild man. I said, I went on, my story progresses. I always say I partied like a rock star, minus the talent, had no talent whatsoever, but that's the way I was partying. And if there was ever a point where the big book talks about, the problem drinker, and if there's a point in his, drinking career where he gets in some sort of trouble, or, his wife's going to leave him, or DUI or whatever, and he decides, hey, I'm just going to put the plug in the jug. If there was ever a point in my drinking career that was an option, I blew right through it because I was having a good time, right? And so I moved over to the big city of Philomath. When I was 17 years old, I got out of school and started fighting wildfires. That was my first job. So right into the somewhat of the timber industry. In the big town of Philomath, there was about 4,000 people, and there was police officers in Philomath. So right off the bat, that's where I just started making bad decisions. Doesn't make me an alcoholic, but I'm very impulsive. I'm sure a few of you can relate. As soon as I ingest alcohol, I'm just making, I always say it's kind of like the third step. I take a drink of alcohol, I make bad decisions, followed with vigorous action. And that's the story of my life. So 18 years old, I got my first DUI, and I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. I did an outpatient, and it took me, I think, 13 months to complete an 18-week program. That's about on par. And I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. I had to get my slip signed, so I went into it was a Thursday night meeting. There was about 10 people there, which is about average for a town of 4,000. And the only thing I remember the topic was serenity, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And so they were going around in a circle, and the only thing I remember was this woman goes, and she was old, like 40 years old at the time. And I was like, she's talking about, my idea of serenity is I stay home on a Friday night and I pet my cat. And I'm like, wow, we're living in two different universes, right? Like, now these days I look back on it like, maybe she was hitting on me. I don't know. I was too young to get the cue, right? Like, I don't know what she was talking about, but it scared me out of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll tell you that right now. So that was that was my introduction. It took me, and if you're new here, and if you're new here, I want to welcome you to Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, honestly, the only thing that I'm doing up here is carrying the message to the alcoholic that still suffers, and I hope I do that, and the rest of you, there might be only one person out there that needs to hear what I have to say, and the rest of you can have some coffee and, enjoy yourself, enjoy the next speaker. So so that was my introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't suggest this, but I found out real quick that you could sign your own slip. And so I signed my own slip, and I was out of Alcoholics Anonymous. I graduated. And so I started, I went into the logging industry, and that was, we're talking about on the West Coast, and we're talking 200-foot trees, very dangerous. I know a lot of men that have been killed, crippled, just in the tiny town where I grew up. So it's a heavy drinking industry, and that's just what it is, just part of the culture. So, that's how I did. We'd get off work, we'd hit the crew cab, it didn't matter if I was 21 or not. You do work like that, you're going to drink, you work like a man, you're going to drink like a man. But I'm an alcoholic, so it just progressed. By the age of 20, I had already been married and divorced. And I had a son, and I hate to say it, but I just turned my back on my family. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that was me, 100%, and that was it. I wanted the next party, and my wife thought, I was going to quit drinking and quit partying once we got together. And, as a true alcoholic, especially at that age, somebody mentioned youth earlier, I just wasn't ready at all to settle down, and those are regrets, later on in life, big regrets. But I got into some other stuff. I was doing hard work. So got into the other stuff without naming everything that it was, is I got some stuff that would extend my weekends, because I would come home Friday night just exhausted, and it's Sunday, so I'm like, pretty soon my weekends are 48 hours, 72 hours. I mean, I know you get the idea. And I started getting into more trouble. I was lucky that when I would show up to work, it was hard work, and my boss liked me. So I would go to jail, and that's during the time I'd be sober, and they used to do work release there. So they would send a crew cab by for me at like 3:30 in the morning, pick me up out of the county jail, and then they'd drop me off at night. And the jail would pack me a nice little sack lunch, and they would wash my logging clothes, which never got washed otherwise. And they'd fold them up, and they'd knock on the door in the morning, "Mr. Zyback, it's time to get up for work." I'm like, this is better than being married. Like, why? Like, this is great, right? I just come home, get a hot shower, get my clothes folded, and so it wasn't that bad. And that's the way I was. It was like consequences was not in my vocabulary ever, and we talked about delusion. It was delusion. That was where our alcoholic life becomes our only normal one. And that was me 100%. And so it just, it progressed from there. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but a lot of county jail time. I ended up in a 19 to 24 month prison sentence hanging over my head. That was at the age of 24. I'd just gotten out of a 6-month treatment program, and I'm doing I'm graduating, and I'm telling the guy, you give me a lie detector test when I'm leaving there, I'm going to be back for your graduation next week. Everything's going good. My dad picks me up, and within 24 hours of leaving there, and that was piggybacked on months jail sentence, within hours of leaving there, I'm going to see the girl I'm not supposed to be doing, seeing. Well, yeah, that too. Freudian slip. So you get the idea, right? Woo! So anyway, and I'm doing the things that I'm not supposed to be doing, and I'm drinking the things that I'm not supposed to be drinking. And 3 months later, I get in the fight in the middle of a bar, and I knew that. I got up before the judge. And I was going to prison. I knew it as soon as they put the cuffs on me. And my dad at that time came down and he said, he asked my attorney, can I say a few words on my son's behalf? And my attorney at that time was happy to let anybody come in, and say some words on my behalf. And it's one of the things I go back, my dad says one of the most heartbreaking moments he had as a father, right? I grew up a good kid. I never got suspended from high school. I got along with everybody. And to be at this point where I come in, shackled and handcuffed to these other guys was a heartbreaking moment for my dad. So when he went up to speak on my behalf, he said, this is my son here that's in court today. And I believe he's becoming institutionalized. He's a danger to himself and he's a danger to society. And just give him the maximum amount of time as you can give him here today. And that was my dad speaking on my behalf. So it's like my attorney was just thrilled. And so that's it, And from there I went off and I went over to EOCI, the second biggest prison in Oregon. And I was able to go into this boot camp program at the time, which was led by ex-military. It was 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And like many alcoholics, I did very well in there. And it was, if you completed it, you get, a pretty good chunk of time shaved off your sentence. And so I completed it. I was one of 23 out of 63 or 64 that completed in my platoon. And alcohol and drug classes, everything, permission to take a shower, permission to eat, sleep, it was like 2-minute showers. It was straight up military, led by, former Marines, Army, the whole thing. So, but I excelled in there. And us alcoholics are undisciplined people, right? And as long as I'm disciplined, even if it's by the court system, I can do all right. And so I went through there and I wanted to and this is where I started thinking, well, Benton County was the problem. I was down in the Corvallis where they have OSU, that was the problem. I had ran rampant down there and I needed to get out. So I got sent a letter to my aunt and asked her if I could move up to Portland because I wanted to get away from the drugs and alcohol. So obviously I was still not thinking too straight. And I get out, and that's what I do. And I move up to Portland, and, you want to talk about delusion. I'm like, I'm going to excel. I'm going to do something different in life. And I start community college. I'm going to be a police officer because that's the next, reasonable step for a guy that just got out of prison, right? And so just delusions of grandeur. And so 3.5 years later, I'm still living with my aunt. My uncle was a local legend guitarist, so it wasn't like they were just prim and proper. I'd go out and drink in the bars, and I thought the other stuff was my problem, and I was kind of trying to move away from that. But when I moved up to Portland, the first time I drank, and I'd went several months without drinking when I moved up there, but went out to a Christmas party. I was working for my aunt's company, and they had microbrews. That's when they were first getting big, and I'm like, I was weaned on Olympia beer and hams, right? So this microbrew has got to be something different, but it still has alcohol in it. So it was like right off the bat, I start doing the same thing, and you guys get the picture. 3.5 years later, my aunt's, we've done all we can do here for you, Aaron. You're going to have to move on, and I wasn't working. I was flunking out of school. So I was going to move out, and I started applying for jobs. I have this criminal history, and what they told me with the criminal history, what they told me in boot camp, just mark yes on the application. And as soon as you get in for an interview, just tell them the truth about what happened. So I start by telling the truth. I mark yes on the application, and I think it's going in the old round file because I applied for several jobs and never got one call. So I had a friend that was a union guy. He was a Teamster, worked for a distribution center, and a legal one. And so so he said, "Hey, come out here." It was a big DC. It was for Kroger, and he said they're pretty lenient on the background check, as far as I can tell. Just mark no on that, and we can probably get you in the door. And that's what I did. And I marked no, and they got me in the door, and I started working as a union guy, and I started working swing shift, and I was trying to clean up my other act. I'd pass the UAs to get in there, and I think at that time I put together a couple weeks of sobriety, and that's the story of my life. Big book talks about it. One more attempt, one more failure. One more attempt, one more failure, and that's how it is. So I get off work at 12:30 in the morning. There's 3 bars right across the street. A lot of these guys go over and hit the bar, and 90% of them can go home to their wife or their kids and get up in the morning and do whatever it is. Take them to sports, take them to school. But I'm that 10% like you guys, where once I go over there and I ingest alcohol into my system, I don't know when the party's going to end. And it's real simple for me. It's that allergy that Phyllis was talking about. You know, it's an abnormal reaction. Once I take that drink, I crave another drink. And once I take that drink, I get thirstier. And I just don't know when the party's going to end. And that's been the story of my life, you know, is just... You know, that was it. And you know, back and forth to that. I got in some trouble there with attendance. You know, just a little side note, by the time I was done with that job, I'd been suspended for attendance over 30 times, I believe. Very lenient attendance program with the union. And that was all due to drinking. So it was about 2001, I went up there and I said, hey, told the general manager, and I was just getting sick and tired of being sick and tired, honestly. And I wanted to save my job. And I said, hey, you know, and I threw down everything I'd been written up for, and I said, you know, every time I've been in trouble here, it's been behind drinking, behind alcohol, and I think I have a serious problem and I need some help. And that's the first time that ever came out of my mouth. And so they let me do a follow-up, an outpatient treatment program, and I started doing really well, like a lot of us do, you know, and I feel better, and I'm going to work, but I haven't solved the problem, which the problem is me. But I've got the alcohol out of the way. I start putting in some overtime hours, and I start putting together some months of sobriety. I'd dip into Alcoholics Anonymous and some other fellowships, and I'd sit in the back on what I call death row, you know, and scoot out the back, and I saw that it worked for you guys. And I listened, you know, a little bit of the big book, and it's like, you're never going to find me in that book. You know, in me was such arrogance that I would always say, I'm the power, right? When the fun is over, I'm going to put the plug in the jug. When the party's over, and that included all the wreckage that I just had a blast going through. When the party's over, and when the party was over is when my spirit just started dying, you know? And at that time, alcohol had its hook so far in me that I just couldn't stop. And so I put together some sobriety this time. Like I said, I worked in a warehouse with about 300 guys. And there was about 5 women that worked in there. And there was a young lady that started work there by the name of Megan. And I say it was like working in a prison. So, you know, every woman's beautiful. If she looks better than Brian, she's beautiful, right? That's just the way it is when you work in that kind of environment. But this was a beautiful young lady. And, I mean, looking back on it, I mean, she had the long blonde hair and the angelic, the pale skin. And just a sweetheart. And she was a normie. Her dad worked graveyard on the other end. His name was Martin. He looked like a bulldog. I didn't know him. I didn't, you know, we were 2 different shifts, huge outfit we were working for. And he had told everybody down on his shift, nobody is to talk to or touch my daughter. I didn't get the memo down on my end of the warehouse, right? So right off the bat, this guy, he starts asking around about me, and I don't have the best reputation, but I wasn't drinking. And what happened is Megan and I started going out on some dates, and I was honest with her, and we clicked. She was a normie, didn't drink, no other outside issues, and I was honest with her. You know, one of these nights I said, you know, I'm falling in love with you, but I have to tell you the truth is I have this serious drinking problem that you haven't seen. And if I start drinking, if I drink, you're going to have to leave me, you know. And I threw that out there. And I don't think she understood, you know, the extent of what I was talking about. A lot of my past, you know, I'd kept secret. That's why I love that page 124 there, you know, our dark past in God's hands, right? Is one of the greatest assets we have. In my hands, it's just a dark past. It's a secret, and it keeps me sick. And there was a lot of stuff that I didn't want exposed about me, you know, and that was the best I could do is tell her, you know, I had this serious drinking problem. And long story short, I go to visit a buddy of mine. I spent some time in South Dakota. That's where my mom's family's from. And I spent some summers back there and made a good friend, and I go back to visit. I had about 9 months of sobriety. Oh, let me back up. I'll tell you a little bit about Martin, her dad. So he's this big, like, hillbilly guy, right? And salt of the earth, built like a bulldog, still looks like a bulldog. And so it took him about 6 months, and I'm still sober during this point, before he would even meet me. And so I went over to their house for a very silent dinner. And it was like dead silent. He didn't talk to me. And afterwards, Megan and I had a date. We were going to the movies, and she said, "Well, Dad, if you want to talk to Aaron, you're gonna have to, bring him in the other room and talk to him." So I was basically summoned in there, and he's just that guy where you just sat in silence. It was very uncomfortable. And he started out, and he's like, "Aaron," he goes, "these are the 3 things that I do not like about you." And it was all downhill from there. And I don't remember a lot of it, but it ended with, "That's my little girl out there." And he goes, "I have no problem going to prison for any one of my kids if anybody ever hurts them." And I knew that he meant it. And I'm like, okay. So that was my first introduction to Martin, So anyway, 3 months later or whatever, I go back to South Dakota. I decided to have one drink, and my friend was like, "You don't have to do this." And I'm like, think I got it handled, and I sat that beer. We went to a bar, and I remember looking at it, and I don't know how long it was, and it felt like 20 minutes, but it doesn't matter if it's 20 minutes, 20 seconds, 20 days. If I set it there and I think about it, that mental obsession kicks in, and I'm going to eventually drink it. And that's what I did. And right there, I don't know when it's going to stop. And I woke up in a blackout on his couch, and no idea how I got there. And the thing I did different is I went back home, and I told Megan the truth. I said, "Hey, I drank while I was gone." And I remember her just breaking down and crying, like she knew something that I didn't. And what that did was, for an alcoholic of my type, was she didn't leave, right? And it opened up the door for the next time and the next time, and the hiding the alcohol. And, she would buy me books and she loved me. She loved me for when I was sober. That's the deal, is she fell in love with the sober me. And she's buying me books on alternatives to abstinence, which is like, I get to the point where it's like, you can try 2 controlled drinks, and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, it's highlighted. I still have the book at home. That's as far as I'd get, because the 2 controlled drinks just didn't work for me. And so, yeah, she was, and God bless Al-Anon, she was the first person in my life that cared enough to go to Al-Anon and see what she could do, is part of the relationship to hang on. And so that was, that went on for the next several years. Another DUI. She was the person in my life that reestablished a relationship with my son, who was 11 or 12 years old at the time. She said, "Don't you want to know your son better?" I always say with my son, and I don't know if anybody relates, but I'd show up for what I call photo ops. You go through an old family album, you'll see me there on birthdays and Christmas, sometimes. And a lot of the times I wasn't, and there was times where I remember my dad telling him, "Hey, your dad's gonna come down here for Christmas." My son was 6 or 7 years old, and him looking around the corner, thinking I was, gonna jump out and surprise him, and I just wouldn't show up. And that's what kind of father I was. And so she reestablished that relationship, and I was able to start, having, even though I'm battling alcoholism, I was able to get to know my son a little bit and have him up for some time and pick him up. And but that's through that whole 5 year, one more attempt, one more failure, one more attempt, one more failure. And I was just so sick, alcohol hidden all over. And we lived in this apartment complex, and I had a buddy that lived on the other side of it, and I was always walking the dog, right? And I'd go up to his house and down a couple shots of whiskey, and I'm like, that was the healthiest dog I've ever had, right? I have trouble getting out and walking the dog, but I was always walking that dog. And so, yeah, so it was just a battle, going on and off for the next 5 years, and she stuck with me, and Megan, great person, first woman I ever sat down and watched the sunset with, and I was, 29 years old when I got together with her. And so we ended up buying a house out where I live now, Molalla. It's a town about 10,000. I've always lived in, a smaller town, about 35 miles southeast of Portland. Through one of my periods of sobriety, I actually put together a decent wedding proposal and, hit a ring in the bottom of the stocking and did it right. And she said yes. And I'd asked her father, I don't know why. The only reason is because he had talked to his wife, and his wife had told him, Megan loves Aaron, and you're going to lose this battle. So, you got to be smart as a father. And so he said yes, and I did that part right, but, it just continued. 2006, my son came up to live with us. He was having some issues with his mom, and that was the most spiritually sick, I believe. I'd been in a lot of trouble with the law and all that, like I'd said before, but as far as just hiding my drinking and times where I couldn't get out of bed to make it to work, and I would beg Megan to get up and get me some booze, and just so I could get up and get normal sometimes to make it in, and it was just a sickness, and she stood by me through all of that. And so it was January 1st, 2007, I made a New Year's resolution, and at the very top of it was do not drink, and under that was be a better father, be a better husband, be a better son, and be a better friend. And I knew all of that. I just wanted to be a better man, and I knew all of it fell under, the guise of alcoholism, and that was it. So like I said, I've been bouncing around AA, but I'm going to be all powerful once again. But this is it. This is New Year's, right? And January 1st, 2007, I write that down. You give me a lie detector, that test, and that day, and I'm going to pass it, and I'm going to stay sober the rest of my life. January 5th, 2007, I go downtown Portland. I take my son down there, and I get a DUI with my 16-year-old son in the car. You guys know how it started. I go out for, 1 drink, 2 drink, 3 drinks, and next thing you know, I'm getting pulled over, and they're taking him away in one police car, and he's crying his eyes out, and they're taking me away in another one. My brother-in-law, married to my wife's twin, happens to be a Portland police officer. One of the proudest moments of his, he was down at the station, and all he did is he sent a message down with another officer saying, I know that my brother-in-law is down there and he has a serious problem and he needs some help. And that should be the end of my story. That should be the end of my drinking story. So many times I should have hit bottom, and that was it. Incomprehensible demoralization. They're going to Martin and Megan, they had to come down and pick me up from the police station. I'm never going to drink again. Once again, 5 days later, I'm not going to drink again. And 2 weeks later, I'm driving home from work. For whatever reason, in Oregon, they let you keep your license for 30 days after you get a DUI, hoping you get another one, I guess. I don't know. I'm driving home from work, and then automatically, it's like my car's on autopilot, and I swing in, and I get a beer, a 24-ounce beer for the rest of the ride home, which was a couple. And by the time I hit that 2 miles, past that, I'm going to the next store, and it's on for another 5 days. And during that time, Megan she went to stay with her parents. It got to the point where she took both cars over there. They came over to the house on a Sunday, which was supposed to be my Monday at work, Martin and Gail, her parents, and said, Aaron, you got to get up and you got to go to work. And they couldn't leave. They were there for hours, giving me coffee, doing the whole thing that, normal people do. I'm going to the back, and I'm pulling off the rest of the whiskey from the night before. And one thing I promise them is I will go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous as soon as you guys leave, but I'm not going to go to work. And as soon as they left, I'm looking through the blinds, and I remember her dad just having his head hung down like a father that had been beaten because he wanted to do the right thing by his daughter. And I remember my mother-in-law turning around, and she looked at the back of the house in just disgust. And I'll never forget that. And they couldn't leave fast enough. And I went down and I got more booze, and I kept drinking for another couple days. And that's just the way it was, just wreckage. And at the end of that 2 days, for whatever, I just had a revelation, and I called Megan on the phone, and this is where things happened for me. And I begged her to come back. And I sat with her eye to eye, and I just broke down. For once, I think that was the most honest thing that I said. I'm like, I can't do this. I need help. I can't do this. And I left her a note on and for whatever reason at that time, I felt that she believed me for once. And I was speaking from the heart. I know at that point I was 100% truthful. And I asked her I left her a note, please stay home with me tomorrow and go to some AA meetings with me. And she got up. I came too. She was already gone, going to work like a normal person. And that's what happened is I went down to the noon meeting in Oregon City, drove about 12 miles down there, free to be me, and I walked into that noon meeting, and my life changed. Somebody read out of the big book, and thank God for people that still read out of the big book, and they weren't doing a check-in meeting of how their week went or how their day went or how happy they were. They were reading out of the big book, and I can't tell you who was chairing that day, what else they said. I've never been able to pinpoint them since. And I have a buddy, Ron, who always says, angels, the definition of an angel is a messenger, right? And for whatever reason there was a messenger that day that read out of the big book that read, "But what about the real alcoholic?" And I'll paraphrase. Here's the guy that's been puzzling you. He builds his life up and he tears it down, more or less insanely drunk all the time. A real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And they were reading to me, and that was me. And that caused me to buy 2 big books that day. And I made my first act of amends as I drove by my in-laws' house, which was right off the highway. And I walked in and I gave it to I told my mother-in-law, "I'm really sorry about what's been going on with your daughter. You know, if you read this book, you'll probably figure out some things that are wrong with me." I hadn't even cracked the cover yet myself, right? So I hadn't even got home. And thankfully, nobody had told me, you know, what page that was on. And I got home and I just started reading from the beginning. And I found myself on every page of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's been my go-to. The meat and potatoes of Alcoholics Anonymous is in the big book in the 12 steps. And I started reading through there, and I'd go back to that meeting every single day. I remember going up to Martin that night, and I found him on his wing at the distribution center. And I said, "Martin, I apologize, and I'm sorry for what's been going on, and this will never happen again." And he said, "I hope not." And he'll tell you to this day, he did not believe a word that I had to say. And so I kept going back to that noon meeting, and they'd say, "Is there anybody here in their first 30 days of sobriety?" And I'd raise my hand and say, "My name's Aaron, I'm an alcoholic," every day. And I'm like, they think I'm drinking every night, right? It was the longest 30 days of my life. I wasn't drinking, but it was like that's all they would say. "Is there anybody here in their first 30 days of sobriety?" But what happened is I became accountable to that group, accountable to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I had a goal. You know, I wanted to hit that 30 days so bad. And I started hearing the things in there that gave me hope. I heard hope the other day. Probably a lot of you have heard this. Was, you know, the acronym is hearing other people's experience, and that's what it was. Is I heard hope from you guys, and it lit a fire. You know, early on in Alcoholics Anonymous, right off the bat. You know, I was one of those guys that when I walked into that room, January 24, 2007, somebody read to me, and I left with those big books of Alcoholics Anonymous. That obsession to drink has never returned for me. I know that's not everybody's experience, but my obsession, my brother used to say, was like a hamster on a squeaky wheel. You know, wouldn't shut off if I wanted that drink. And for that to be relieved is an absolute miracle. And for the next 30 days, it was like the stars aligned in my life of everything I needed to hear in Alcoholics Anonymous. There was a hurdle. The hurdle for me was God. You know, the first step, you know, and I think I heard it first from Joe and Charlie. Yeah, I worked on that first step for 20 years. You know, there was no doubt that I was powerless over alcohol by the time I came in here. My life was unmanageable. Step 2, I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And that doesn't mean I came in here and I skipped out the first day believing in God and a higher power, whatever was being talked about. I came to believe with an open mind and an open heart because I was so beat up. And I always tell new guys, there was a new guy I was just telling Brian that the other day he got 90 days. He goes, "I'll never forget." He goes, I congratulate him. And he says, "That first day when you said, you know, if you're new, I hope you've burned your life so far to the ground and it's so crappy that you give this thing an honest shot." And I looked at him and I said, "Mike, you look like you're pretty damn beat up. You just might get this thing." He goes, "I'll never forget that." And that's how I feel about alcohol. I was just beat up enough to give it an honest shot. And the hurdle for me was God. And luckily, I had looked through the meeting schedule, and I found the Canby Saturday breakfast meeting. And I thought, well, everybody in there can afford breakfast. You know, they must be doing better than I am. And so I went in there, and that's where I found the attraction rather than promotion. It was a plug-in of electricity in that room, and people were talking about, you know, traveling places and going to concerts, sporting events, and all this stuff. And the laughter, you know, like the laughter here today, that is the food for me. That's the energy, the life's blood of Alcoholics Anonymous for me, because I don't feel I hadn't laughed or cried, I felt honestly, in years. I was just dead inside. And that drew me in. And so I started going to that meeting. Megan would drive me there on the Saturdays. This is very early on, my first 30 days, and she would wait outside for me. It's an hour-and-a-half meeting. And that's where I heard, you know, I know Cliff and Lori know this guy, a guy by the name of Ron H. And he's still a home group member to this day. Him and I are very close, but I didn't know Ron's story. He was celebrating 18 years. This is 3 weeks into my sobriety. And Ron's story was he was in a drunk driving crash in the late 80s, and he had killed a mother and her 2 children. He had done 8 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. And while he was in there, a guy by the name of Chicago John brought a meeting. God bless everybody that does H&I in here, because I'm a direct result of H&I, people bringing in hospitals and institutions to an institution that I wasn't in. Because what it was told to Ron by Chicago John was, Ron, you can't unring the bell, but you never have to ring it again. And Ron packed that message out, and when he said that day, something just hit me in the heart, and I never have to ring that bell again. And the thing about Ron was he has a story, he's so humble, and it was the feedback of the other people that had said, what Ron had done to help them, and what he had given back to Alcoholics Anonymous. And he talked about a letter of forgiveness from the victim's family that he had. And man, it just kicked the windows in, it just kicked the door in for a power greater than myself. And I went home that day, and I was on fire, and I dug through this book, and I found a simple prayer in there. And this is where when I reflect back, this is people might disagree, but I found a simple prayer in there. It was, "Thy will, not mine, be done." And what I'd heard in here the last several weeks was prayers work better when you hit your knees. And that night, I started hitting my knees, and I would say, "Thy will, not mine, be done." And that is simple as that. "Thy will, not mine, be done." And I heard Ron's story, and that was February 17th, a few days after his birthday. And I remember that because it was the same day. That was my first sponsor's birthday. The first guy that walked across the room and gave me his number, that became my first sponsor. And so early on, I jumped on this thing and got a sponsor, and I did what I was supposed to do this time. And I remember Megan and I had gone to it was a follow-up Bob Seger concert, and it was a Valentine's Day concert, and we went there. And I remember the last concert I'd went to her was Guns N' Roses, and I was plowed. Met a couple girls from the bank that she knew. I didn't remember meeting them at all. So this was, so she's saying, "I wonder how many people from the bank I'm going to see there tonight." And I'm like, "I wonder how many of those AAs I'm going to see here tonight," right? Now this is 3 weeks in, and I literally stepped out. 20,000 people, and I step out onto one of the stands, and I look over, and there was a guy sitting there that was in that breakfast meeting that morning. And I run over, and I do everything I'm not supposed. He's this old biker guy, and I run over. I'm like, "Hey, John, I'm here. I ate breakfast with you this morning." And he's looking at me like, "Who gives a crap?" But that was the angel. That was my boy. That showed me you guys were out living this, right? And so it was just, "Thy will, not mine, be done" for a couple more days. And I'm looking up, and I'm getting into my 30 days of sobriety, and 29 days, and I'm hanging on to the breakfast meeting gives the nice solid heavy metal. They gave me a 24-hour coin as well, and I'm holding on to that, and I'm working in this warehouse, and I find a place that was quiet. And I'm doing now, looking back now, it was what we call, a meditation, where my life was going, how good it had been, the things I had heard in the last 30 days. And that's how fast your life can change in this thing, if you grab hold of it and connect with something bigger than yourself. And that's what had happened. And I was so grateful. And I'm just sitting there, and that's rolling past midnight into my 30 days. And I got home that night, and it was about 2 a.m. I'd worked a little bit of overtime, and I walked into my bedroom, and I found Megan, and she wasn't breathing. And I called 911. I'd never had to call 911 before, and they said, "Pull her out of bed and prop her head up and start doing CPR." And they were walking me through it, and I'm doing CPR, and I'm like, "Get here as fast as you can." I live in a tiny little town, and it felt like it took them hours to get there. And it was probably just a couple minutes, and I'm working on her, and they said, "Can we call anybody?" And at that time, I still had a number memorized, and I said, "Call her father." And I gave him the number. And they showed up. Paramedics got there before Martin did. He lives about 7 miles away. And they went back there just in the bedroom for just a couple minutes, and they worked on her. And they said, "Sir, can we see you in the other room?" And I knew right then she was gone, And that was my rock. Besides my mother, that was probably the last person that ever believed in me. And Martin walked in, and I tried to grab. I said, "Martin, she didn't make it." And he shoved past me, and the paramedics grabbed him in the kitchen. And you see this big man, and he just crumbled to the ground. And I heard the sound of a father's heart break that day. I never want to hear it again. And that was 30 days, right? That was 30 days, and my life turned upside down. I remember the coroner coming in. Anybody that's been through something like that, you have police officers in the house, paramedics, the coroner, because they're trying to rule everything out. And the coroner comes out and he says, we found some recovery books next to the nightstand. You know, that was my big book in the 12 and 12. And he said, were those hers? And I said, no, those are mine. And I had no idea why he was asking me at that time. But now, years into this thing, I understand why, because they were trying to rule out. We lose so many people that just can't get this thing, that reach that jumping off point before they can grasp it, right? And that's what they were trying to rule out. And 30 days, you know, I got family coming in. I don't make it to the noon meeting that next day, and here I am. And that night, I sat there and I'm processing everything. You know, Megan was 24 years old, very young, no health problems. She had epilepsy. 4 or 5 seizures ever, and they said, you know, never worry about them, and they're not life-threatening. Just come to the hospital when you get her medications checked. And but obviously they were wrong. And so I think that next night, that Friday night, and I'm rolling all this over in my head, and I'm in shock. And I was in shock for probably a month of this. But what I thought about, 24 hours before, 29 days rolling into 30 days, what was I thinking? How grateful I was. How my life was on track, how I'd heard these things, Ron's story, the whole thing, this higher power that had moved me, right? And I had to believe that God was everything, or he was nothing at that moment. And I hit my knees that night. I said, thy will, not mine, be done. And I'm sleeping on the living room floor because I can't go back to the bedroom. And the next day is Saturday. And the door was locked. Every time I even come close to ever doubting a higher power in my life, I think of this moment. I'm sleeping on the living room floor because I couldn't go back to the bedroom for months. And Martin walks through the door. The father-in-law, I'm not son-in-law of the year, right? And he just walked in and he said, this is the last thing I promised my daughter, is to get you up and get you to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous this morning, and you're going to get up and you're going to go. What I didn't know, the night before she passed away, she had called Martin and said, hey, Dad, I got to work on Saturday. Can you get Aaron to this meeting? One meeting. And that man, losing a daughter, one of the loves of his life, one of the greatest loves of his life, he remembers to get up and come get me. And he takes me to the breakfast meeting. And that's where I collected my 30-day coin. And there was a guy in there by the name of Steve Little. He said, this is Alcoholics Anonymous. When one of us hurts, we all hurt. You guys surrounded us with love and compassion. And I collected that 30-day coin from a man I didn't know from Adam, who is one of my very best friends to this day. His name was Gary. And he gives me a hug, right, like we do. It says, keep coming back. And that room surrounded us, and Martin will say to this day, with the love, compassion, and empathy of nothing like he's ever seen. And people stayed for an hour. And I'm so grateful for that meeting and meetings like it, that they didn't just leave, you know, because I've seen that happen. They stayed. And every time I think back of that guy, the guys that surrounded us and gave us numbers and talked to us, I look at them and go, those guys have either died sober or they're still sober. And I think about what they did, and they were working the 12th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. They were concerned, not outside themselves, whatever was going on with their family or what they had to do that day. They stayed with us, and they hugged, and they cried, and told us to keep coming back. And that's what I did. The next week, we had to put together a memorial real quick for anybody that's dealt with sudden death. And I like to talk. My buddy Andy back there sends me some great musical stuff. That's a devotion every day that's connected to the 12 steps and some part of AA literature. And music is a huge part of my spirituality. And I remember The only thing that I could get out, and Megan let me pick the music for her for the wedding, and I don't know why she did, but I'm a huge Johnny Cash fan, and I picked "Walk the Line," right? It was a slowed down version by Travis Tritt, but Johnny Cash himself had said it was the most beautiful version he had ever heard. And the only thing that I could get up there and say was, "This is the first and last song that I danced to my wife with," and it's a promise, and it's a dedication. And you guys know the story of the Johnny, the Walk the Line, that I was going to do this for the rest of my life. But I don't have that power. You guys have helped me do that for the rest of you up here for the last 17 years, one day at a time, to keep that promise, to keep walking the line, to remain sober, to remain connected to Alcoholics Anonymous. And my brother got up there. I might butcher this because usually I read it, but he got up there, and like I said, Megan was 24 years old, and he read a little piece by Neil Young, and it says, "Old man, look at my life, 24, and there's so much more. We live alone in a paradise that makes me think of two. Love lost, such a cost. Give me things that won't get tossed. Won't get lost, like a coin that won't get tossed, rolling home to you." And at that time, I'm gripping onto that 30-day coin for dear life. And if anybody says those things, those coins or whatever don't mean anything, I'll beg to differ with you. And I'm hanging on to it, and I feel like Megan's talking to her father through that song, "The Old Man," right? And I'll tell you what, something about that old man is he drove me to that Saturday breakfast meeting every Saturday for the next 3 years. He took his time out of his day, and he'd tell people, "I've got a meeting to go to." And that's what he did. A father that didn't like me, that didn't love me. We developed a love, and he developed a love for me, and me a love for him through Alcoholics Anonymous. And you guys would let him share. Thank God for the open meetings. And he would say, "My name's Martin. I'm an honorary alcoholic." And that's funny, but I was, and he would just share this salt of the earth stuff, and people would just cry, He'd say, I don't have the nicest house. I don't drive the nicest car, but I'm one of the richest men I know because I got a family that loves me, right? And that's how I feel about Alcoholics Anonymous today, I have a family that loves me in here, and it grows every time, that I get to do anything like this or travel or, it's just a blessing. And so me and that man, he's become a father to me. On Father's Day, I always tell him, "Martin, you haven't been like a father to me. You've been a father to me." And that man has showed me how to live. And he'd say things like, "Aaron, I don't feel like I should be sharing in there because, it's taken time away from an alcoholic. But these guys that I admired, loved, they would call on him because I said, Martin, you're a man that stood by his family, that's done everything right, that would give you the shirt off his back. At least me, that's what I aspire to be in Alcoholics Anonymous." That man's one of my heroes, one of my heroes. And so he took me to that. And I started working the steps in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I jumped in early on, and I like to be a part of this. I like to pull people into the middle. I was telling Brian, it's like the Arnold Schwarzenegger, "Come with me if you want to live." That's how I feel about Alcoholics Anonymous. I get wound up on this thing because it's like, there's such a power in these rooms, and there's a lot of empty seats. I think Joe's, it was either Alan or Joe said that, there's a lot of empty seats in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I have a friend that's battling cancer right now. And I always say, if we had a cure to cancer in here, we'd have a line from here to Oregon trying to get in here. If we said we can cure that, but we say, "Hey, we have a cure. You just have to do this. It's a spiritual program, and here, read this book." And people go, "Yeah, I'm not much of a reader, though. I'm kind of busy." How does this work? And it's such a simple program, and you just want to hand it to these guys because it's so life changing. So and I'll just tell you a little bit about the working the steps, what had happened with my job. I got promoted to the same job. I got promoted to foreman. I made Employee of the Year out of 300 people. On my 10th year, I got sober about 8 years in. My 10th year, they called me into the office, said, "You might need a shop steward." And they said, "We need to hear the truth about your criminal history." And so I was terminated in 2009 for falsifying my application in 1999. We call that the wreckage of our past. And but I knew there was part of me that was like a monkey on my back. Like, how am I going to take care of this? And God does for us what we could not do for ourselves. So I went to work for an old boss of mine. He had called Martin, my father-in-law, and my old boss. He was working for this new company. And he said, well, I know Aaron. He was looking for some employees. He said, Aaron's out looking for work. He goes, no, I have no interest hiring in what became vouchable in Alcoholics Anonymous. And a man that once hated me said, I'll vouch for him. He's changed his life. He goes Alcoholics Anonymous. He quit drinking. And Rick said, I'll bring him on. I'll bring him on for 2 weeks. It was their busy season during the Christmas season. And I went to work for half of what I was making at my other job. I was just grateful. 2 weeks, and I've been there 14 years now. And I worked my way up through management and the whole thing. And that's all Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, that's nothing that I've done. I knew I was in the right spot. About a month or two in, the CEO came to visit, and he called me up in his office. He said, hey, Rick's told me a little bit about your past. And he goes, you an alcoholic? And I said, well, yeah. He goes, my brother's an alcoholic, and he has 10 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I go, wow, and I go to shake his hand, and he gives me a hug, right? And that's the CEO of the company. I knew right then God had put me exactly where I needed to be, right? And that's how it's been through my whole sobriety. God has put me in these places where I needed to be. And the gifts I've got, for you out here, Mount Hood, 11,000 feet in the air. I climbed that at 18 months sober, and I took a pocket full of Megan's ashes with me, and I trudged up that mountain, and you can see out there, you can't tell where the earth ends and the sky begins, right? And I thank God, and I thank Alcoholics Anonymous, and I take those ashes and I spread them to the wind as close to heaven as I can get, and I thank you guys, right? And it's things like that, and I was a guy that couldn't make it out of bed to go to the coast, which was an hour and a half away, and I got to stay with my toes on the edge of the Grand Canyon and pull lobsters off of the boat in Nova Scotia and all this stuff. And every time I come to Oklahoma, everything is an adventure to me in Alcoholics Anonymous, because I was given a life that I didn't deserve, a life that I never knew was possible through Alcoholics Anonymous. So I went through the court system, that whole thing. I had to do that after Megan passed. I got in there and I had court. It was a DUI intensive supervision program. It was so heavy duty, like it was shaved 90 days jail off. I would have lost my house, the whole thing. I remember, trying to plead with the judge to let me drive. I lost my license for 4 years. And the judge said, I'm sure your wife's family would be more than happy to help you out. And I'm like, how does he know, And I remember Martin, he took me to the court, just do what you're supposed to do. It was like lie detector test. This is no joke. I had to sell one of my vehicles. I couldn't have the other one at the house for a year. And I just trudged through that with the help of Alcoholics Anonymous, with working the steps. And when I graduated that program, I was the first one to graduate early. And I had a wing of Alcoholics Anonymous on either side. And those were the guys that had hung back with me that day. They're still there, still doing this thing with me. And that's Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I'll read a quick letter and this is a thank you to you guys. It's not anything that I did. Whoops, I'm going to try to get these out of here. But 2009, I was 2 years into this thing. I was still going through the court system, and I was crossing all the T's and dotting the I's, and I received a letter. I go out to the mailbox walking because I still couldn't drive, and I go out to the mailbox, and it's from the Circuit Court of the state of Oregon. I'm like, God, these are never good. I'm rolling things through my head. I'm like, I think everything's been going good, but I open it up and it says, Dear Mr. Zyback, Mr. Wiedenhofer forwarded me a copy of the email you sent of January 22nd, indicating you will mark 2 years of sobriety on January 24th, 2009. I did not want to miss this opportunity to participate in congratulating you on your success this far. You made an impact on me when you started DISP. The loss of your wife was tragic, and you had many burdens to bear. As far as I can see, you've risen to this challenge beautifully. You've shown a commitment to your sobriety and the health of you and your family that I hope you feel serves you well. I believe it does. It is always easy to do well when life goes our way. The true test of character and commitment comes when life asks more of us than we expected. You have demonstrated an ability to stay centered in the midst of chaos and have moved through it to, I hope, a place of peace. May your higher power watch over you and your family as you continue through to a successful completion of DISP and a joyous free life. Best wishes, Kathleen M. Daly, Circuit Court Judge. And that's not a chain letter, you know. That's and for a judge to use the words higher power and all of that, you know, it just hit me. And the first person I called that was closest to Megan was her twin. And I read her that letter, and I just lost it, you know, and I took it into my home group, and once again I lost it. And like I said, this is a thank you to you guys for standing by me and to be able to get me through that stuff, the roughest times of my life. You know, you guys have been here for me. The peaks and valleys, somebody was talking about, I think it was Alan, you know, the flat line. You don't want that flat line. You want those peaks and valleys. And I was told to be grateful for the pain, because through the pain comes great growth, right? And that's been my experience. You know, whatever we go through, you know, there's something good on the other side of it, as long as I trust the process and trust in a power greater than me. August 1st, 2010, I got a call from my brother, and Cliff and Lori met him down in Florida, and got a call from my brother. Needed to get his wife to Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, she was stealing his booze and going through his pills, and, you know, it was all about her. And I'm like, okay, so I did what, you know, the meeting 15 minutes from now, right down from your house, the 12 and 12 Club in Portland, which was well known, you know, old school Alcoholics Anonymous. And they went down there and they handed my brother how it works. And he read it for his wife. And he got like halfway through it, and he broke down in tears. Something just punched him in the heart, right? And they had seen, I'd never pushed this program on. This is a couple years into my sobriety. I'd never pushed it. And I try to live a, you know, example of Alcoholics Anonymous today. And I just lived the example, and I knew sooner or later something would shift. They've both been sober since that day, August 1st, 2010. And that's a miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's my one blood brother, as I get to walk, you know, shoulder to shoulder with this guy. And just the love of this program is just beautiful, you know. So, you know, the ups and downs. Yeah, I was married and divorced in Alcoholics Anonymous. I hold no grudges. You know, I was able to, you know, clear that up. And, you know, my life, we talk about being off balance. I'd done a lot of stuff in Alcoholics Anonymous, and sometimes that can take place of the alcohol, right? And I had to look at that, and I had to do some work behind that. But my ex-wife, she'll still tell you, still tells me she loves me, right? My son's mom, I have a great relationship with my son. She invites me down. This is a lady that said I made her life a living hell at one point. Invites me down for Father's Day get-togethers, and her boyfriend will be out there cooking for us. I'm like, this is so weird, right? And I have a beautiful woman in my life, and her son Ulrich. I've been with her for 4 years, and he's been a blessing. So he's 9 years old now, so since the age of 5, and I've been there for every baseball game, basketball game, soccer game, and I've watched him hit his first hit, his first baskets, and I get to live that again, right? I get to live it for the first time, and I look at him, and I catch it out of the corner of my eye how much it means to him. He'll be too cool for it, but I see it. And at that moment, you know, I feel so grateful. But what I reflect on and what keeps me here, and I always reflect on the thing, we do not shut the door on our past. And I think of my son when he was out there. He was the kid that got to look up, and his father wasn't there. And it's moments like that I'm grateful, and I'm reflective, and I remember why I'm here, right? Because I hurt a lot of people. I get to recover through the 12 steps. Some of them never get to be so lucky. You know, we've done a lot of damage, so I try to keep that in my heart. I'm going to wrap up. I'm going long here, but the biggest living amends I got to make was to my mother. And she moved out several years. Megan was still alive when my mom moved out. And my mom had MS her whole life. And like I said, she grew up in the Black Hills of South Dakota on the ranches and the prairies out there. And I was able to move her out. And she had MS, and she lived in assisted living for a while. And then she lived in a care home. But my mom was super cognitive. And we just would go over there, and I would make my mother laugh, just belly laugh. And God, that made me feel good, because it was just that was the amends that I could make to her. My mom would tell me, you know, Aaron, when you were in prison, I would cry the blue out of my eyes. You know, every night I would cry the blue out of my eyes. So to be over there, go over there and make her laugh was one of the biggest joys. And she bragged up me and my brother, and you know, we were the joy in her life. right? And so when she got sick here a couple years ago, it got to the point where all of a sudden, after years, she lived with MS her whole life. But when it starts taking its toll, it can take its toll real fast. And it was a pretty fast progression, and they had told me. And so I started going in there. She only lived a mile away, so I was in there all the time anyway. But to the last days, the last couple months, she would start communicating less and less. And sometimes during the last couple weeks, I'd go in there and she would only eat for me, and some days she wouldn't communicate at all. Some days she would talk to me. And it was a blessing to be able to be there for me, because my mom had a smile that would light up this room, right? I don't think I ever realized that till I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, how bright that smile was, and people loved my mother. And I'd go in there, and to the day she died, she would smile. I say, Mom, and she wouldn't communicate at all. I said, Mom, it's me, Aaron, I'm here, and she'd smile. And during the last probably 2 weeks, she wouldn't talk. And we'd listen to music together. My mom liked a lot of the same thing. We'd listen to Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, and I'd listen and I'd read to her so she could hear my voice. And I'd sit in there for hours at a time. And there was a book I was reading to her by a spiritual giant. You guys can, a spiritual giant in my life at least, and you guys can ask me about it afterwards if you care to. And I'd been bouncing around this book, and it was called Letters to America. And it had this one part in it that said God is a 4-letter word. And I'm like, oh, God, I don't know. Yeah, it's probably. And for whatever reason, one night I'm like, I'm going to read this one. And it was 100% different than I thought. There's a song go by Merle Haggard, Sing Me Back Home, right? And it's a little bit different, and he's Sing Me Back Home. And I feel like when I read this, it was taking my mom in her mind's eye back to those Black Hills, back to the pastures where she grew up, back to the plains of South Dakota, and a comfort that her son knew God, right? It says God is a 4-letter word. It says no matter your religion, you likely have your own idea of what God is. Some think of God as that big guy in the sky who makes all the decisions for us. Some say God is a woman. Some say God is dead. Some say God never was. My view is simple. I believe that God is love, period. End of story. For love runs through everyone and everything. Every one of us loves the flowers. Flowers love the rain. If you love the ocean, you know the ocean lives and loves to caress the shore. Love is the thing we all have in common. We ache for love. We hope for love. We love and like to be loved. And that's God. Take these words of wisdom with you everywhere you go. Tell all the religions of the world, and through them the truth shall flow. But God is love, and love is God, and that's all you need to know. And it goes on to pen a letter to God, and it says, I'll just read part of it. It says, the universe in which we're born is infinitely large, and each of us is so small. We search for meaning when the meaning is all around us, in every moment of our day. We search for you, God. We always have. We try to give you a form that we can understand. You've always been with me in all your many forms. I started in a Methodist church, but found myself at ease with every religion I've tried to understand. I can't tell you now whether I'm a Baptist or a Buddhist. Considering my footwear, maybe I'm just a Buddhist. A boot-wearing man who believes we're put here for a reason, and that by doing our best we may find the light we seek. If not, our souls are eternal, and perhaps next time around we'll do better. You spoke to me in the church. You spoke to me in the fields and in the open pastures. You spoke to me in the songs of the mockingbirds and the blue jays who flew above us. You spoke to me through the rustle of the Texas wind and the trees and through the thunder in the night. And when I paused to listen, you still speak to me. You spoke to me through the music and the guidance from my mother, who told me God always prevails because good and goodness can never be defeated. I wrote a song for you once called In God's Eyes, but maybe I wrote all those songs for you, just as all those songs were gifts from you. You were with me at the birth of my children and at the passing of my friends. You were with me when I gaze out on the blue bonnets of Texas. You're with me when the rooster crows at dawn. He doesn't sound sweeter than the mockingbird, but try telling the rooster that. I feel you when I marvel and wonder at the brilliant rainbows of Maui, and when I sing in the little frontier chapel in Luck, and when I stop for reflection on a quiet weekday in the Methodist church where my sister and I first lifted our voices to the heavens. The beauty of this world and the people in it have always been with us. You give us the power to see and smell and touch it. We are born of love, and it is love that carries us through. And that's what I believe. I believe God is love, and I believe Chuck C. said that at one time. God is love. I 100% believe that. And thank you guys for loving me, for being my teachers in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm forever a student. And if you're new here, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. It is the greatest show on earth. Thank you.